All right. Well, thank you for joining, for those of you who could join today and for those that are attending by the recording. So my name is Sasha Nicole and I am the Development Director for Haiti Outreach. And today we're going to have our Country Director, Neil Van Dyne, and our Executive Director, Dale Snyder, talk a bit about the history of Haiti. Dale is pretty well versed in the history of Haiti, so he'll talk about that for about 15 minutes. And then Neil will talk a bit about how the history impacts life today and kind of link that to how that impacts the way that we go about our work in Haiti. So without further ado, Dale, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Sasha. Thanks for setting this session up, this roundtable. Of course, it's literally impossible. I have 15 minutes to present the history of Haiti, and in 15 minutes to present the history of any country obviously is impossible. And Haiti is very unique in so many different ways. It's a challenge to even do in like 10 minutes, which is what I'm going to try to do. And then the last 5 talk about sort of takeaway lessons or basically underlining certain aspects of the history that may have led to the current circumstances. And I also know that my audience may be very familiar with Haitian history or may have never heard anything about it. So I'll be somewhere in the middle and summarize a lot of what I'm about to talk about. So first of all, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which we all remember from elementary school. And lo and behold, he did in fact stop by the northern coast of what is now called Haiti, the island of Hispaniola, on his very first trip. And a lot of people don't know that the 3 ships that he had, the Santa Maria was one, actually hit a reef and they couldn't repair it or get it to go back to Spain. So they had to unload 39 sailors and took the ship apart and built them a little stockade and said, we'll be back in a year. So that's one interesting fact that occurred in 1492. Obviously, they met a lot of Native American folks. There's 5 major tribes that existed on Hispaniola at that time. And I've heard estimates of 500,000 people or more that lived there. So when he came back a year later, all the sailors were gone and apparently killed. So the aspect of what Columbus and his crew were up to was not only to find a passageway to the Indies quicker than going around Africa, but also they were in search of gold because they were supported by the King and Queen of Spain, and that was their payback. And they found gold on Hispaniola. And what they also found, of course, the native folks, which they had, of course, no knowledge of Christianity at the time. And the Europeans, and especially Columbus and the Spanish and his crew, considered native peoples heathens because they didn't know the Christian story and they weren't Christianized. And that meant that they basically were equivalent to animals and could be treated as such. And so it provided a justification, and that was their point of view, for them to treat them accordingly. And so they tried to enslave the native peoples and take advantage of them to mine the gold that they found there. And for a variety of reasons, of course, they had armaments that the native peoples didn't have. So they were able to subdue them very easily. The Native Americans not only fought back, but many of them fled. And of course, there were also diseases that the Europeans had that they introduced, and it was impossible to say how many of the people were killed because of those diseases, but it could have been up to 90% of the population I've read about. So at any rate, for a variety of reasons, and also the Native Americans just literally would not take to being enslaved. They just died. And so within 30 years, the island was essentially clear of Native American people. And they also wanted to have slaves to mine the gold, and therefore they imported African slaves, and African slavery was an ongoing thing at that time. And so the Africans were absolutely able to withstand the diseases, apparently, and thus began the slave trade that honestly led to how Haiti is basically an African descended population. So the slaves were treated very poorly. They were treated also just like chattel and cattle. Um, the French, who eventually became the controllers of that western third of the island, literally figured out how to maximize the work from the slaves, and actually postulated that if they worked them to death and brought in new slaves, they would actually make more money than if they tried to keep them alive as they aged. So it was to that extent. There's horrible stories of how they were treated in every way possible that the human imagination could come up with. So that was how basically Haiti began. And they found sugar cane, which could be distilled into rum. They found cotton and coffee. And so these ingredients were wonderful items to grow and to sell to the Europeans, which they didn't have. And so a trade was very lucrative, and it turned out to be very popular for the Europeans. And as a result, there were people that came to the Caribbean and, of course, to the Western Hemisphere from Europe, and many of them to create plantations to grow those items and to become wealthy. But it was built on the backs of slaves. Now, of course, originally these were Spanish folks that started to populate the island of Hispaniola, but there were right at that time also English, and there were French and Dutch, both traders and pirates. And so there was a lot of interactive activity of all of those European countries, which were, of course, also rivals of Spain. They would try to get the Spanish galleons when they went to Central and South America and loaded up with additional gold. And then they also would raid the colonies that started and the towns that started on that western part of Hispaniola, because it was right between Cuba and Hispaniola that there was the major shipping lane for them to go back to Spain. So it was sort of an easy pick for a lot of pirates, to the point that the Spanish basically, for a variety of reasons, said they weren't going to defend the western towns of the island, and actually forcibly tried to move people also, because they were trading with the Dutch and they didn't like it, and eventually the French as well. And so there were European wars that eventually led to success by the French, and they, in a treaty in 1697, allowed the Spanish ceded that western third of the island to France. So, in answer to the question, which many people have, how come Hispaniola is not one community, one ethnic group, like Cuba and many of the other islands? Well, this is the reason. And so the western part became French, and the eastern 2/3 was still remained in Spanish control. That obviously created a deal where the entrepreneurs could come in. They created these plantations all the more. In the early 1700s, it was called the Pearl of the Antilles for a variety of reasons, one of which was their success in trade and in becoming wealthy. But again, it was built on the backs of slaves and a high, very high slave to plantation owner ratio. Well, in the 1776, you might remember, the American Revolution occurred, and it was followed very quickly in 1789 by the French Revolution. And the French government was controlled by the kings, the Louis, and they were more or less absolute dictators. And so the call for equality and fraternity of the French Revolution was successful in France in overthrowing the Louis monarchies. And because of that, the new Republican government in the early 1790s declared that there should be no slaves in the French colonies, including in what was called Saint-Domingue at that time, what we now call Haiti. But needless to say, the plantation owners didn't go along with that. The slaves were very aware of it, and so they started a revolution against the plantation owners even before this occurred. But then when the French government actually declared that, then they were definitely revolting against the plantation owners and the French occupiers. Bottom line, from 1791 until 1804, the revolution occurred and the slaves were successful. The first and only in history of the world, a successful slave rebellion that turned into an actual new country. And in 1804, it was declared separate, and even Napoleon and his armies and navies could not conquer what it became Haiti. And as a result, this is a little aside many people don't know, it's argued that Napoleon, who was in charge of France at that time and wanted to destroy the slave rebellion, was so unsuccessful in doing so that he sold the Louisiana Territory, Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Jefferson was president, which doubled the size of the United States. So it could be well argued that the United States exists today, and that purchase occurred as a result of the success of the rebellion in Haiti. However, they did not have a very good, I guess you would say, precedent of what it would be like to govern their own country. Unlike the United States that had the English, if you might remember our American history, we had actual parliaments created as colonies. In Virginia and Massachusetts and many of these other countries, the English established local parliaments where the white landowners could actually have representatives that governed to a certain extent. Of course, the English lords were over them, but there was no such precedence in Haiti. And so what did they want to become? Well, they wanted to become king and emperor, just like Napoleon and the Louis. Well, it didn't last very long. Dessalines, who was the successful general that eventually overthrew the French and became himself declared emperor, was assassinated. And two of the main supporters of the revolution that perhaps caused that assassination then took over parts of Haiti. So it divided into a civil war where northern Haiti was ruled by Henry Christophe, who declared himself king, and the southern part by Pétion, who was a mulatto. And as a result, there were difficulties that both of them had, not only with each other, but Henry Christophe eventually committed suicide because he was about to be overthrown in a coup. Pétion, then the South, ended up getting yellow fever and died. And so right from the beginning, Haiti had great difficulties in getting started. But probably even more important with that was the fact that the world was shocked that this Black Republic would be successful in overthrowing their white landlords and plantation owners and declaring themselves as a country. So what happened? All the governments of the world, including the United States, shunned Haiti. They did not declare it as a country. They did not send representatives. They did not trade. And so Haiti was shut off from the economic activities of the world that were increasing at that time. And so it wasn't until 1825 when the French said, okay, we'll trade with you, but you have to pay us back for all this land and even the value of the slaves that you took from us. And they agreed because they didn't feel they had much choice. And that became, billions and billions of dollars worth of money that they paid back. And that went through all till 1947. So one of the reasons Haiti's in the condition it is because all of this economic money was drained out of their own economy to pay back this indemnity to the French. And so, to summarize many other things, civil wars, um, assassinations of government. There were times of tranquility and progress, and then there were other times where um, there was like 3 or 4 presidents or leaders of Haiti within 4 years. So the main trouble that this caused was twofold. One is, of course, the economy, which I said, and secondly, there was interference by the United States. We actually occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934. Other governments interfered. And so the truth is, the Haiti started off both economically and politically in a very, very difficult situation. Imagine if the United States, George Washington was killed, and the Civil War between the North and the South occurred right after we became independent, and etc. So, if to think of an analogy, that's the closest you can come to. And with that, I would say that really is the foundation that honestly has led to more modern times, which I could talk about more, but I'm running out of time. There you go.
Thank you. Neil, we'll take it over to you for an update on how all of this history impacts, especially the mentality that you encounter in Haiti on a daily basis. And of course, feel free to
Yeah,
share anything you
sure.
want, and then let's try to leave at least 10 minutes or so for Q&A as well.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to talk super long. But it's always interesting to hear the history of Haiti come back, hear it again, hear it regurgitated, I guess is the way it is. And when we talk about countries being resilient, we talk about them being able to handle disruptions to to their society. And Haiti, we've in modern times we've heard about Haiti with earthquakes and hurricanes and so on and so forth. Those didn't just start in the last 30 years. Those have been occurring since the very beginning. Cape Haitian was destroyed by an earthquake in the 1700s. Port-au-Prince was destroyed by an earthquake in the 1700s, and hurricanes and so on and so forth. What Dale alluded to there is that indemnity to France, the however many billions of dollars, took away the funds that they could have used, even if they had good leadership, the funds that they could have used to build the structure and systems in their society that would have made them more resilient. Establishing a framework of a government that covered the whole country, or a road network, or whatever else. These are all things that require huge amounts of investment, and those investments were unable to occur. And in the face of all these natural disasters, the natural vulnerability of the country has continually hammered on Haiti. This is not, like I said, it's not a new thing. This happens on a very regular basis. And so at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to get on your feet when you keep getting knocked down every time you start standing up. And whether that's natural disaster or invasion from extra military forces, those are the challenges that any country deals with in their history. And Haiti's been, I guess, subject to more than most. So I think it's important to recognize the challenges that this country has had over the centuries when we look at them as a struggling, developing country, and what are some of the support mechanisms that we could bring to them that would allow them to step up and step forward on a powerful basis. So for the past 20 or 25 years, Haiti Outreach has been working on that those exact structures with the vision and dream that Haiti be a developed country. And in the background of that, have these resilient systems that create communities that are clean and healthy, that produce and reinforce good citizenship, and that are based on a sound economy. It's those core principles that create a developed country. And when we work with the individual communities that we do across the country, that's what we're doing. We're working to shift and move that conversation towards one of a vision of a developed country, and helping these individual communities build the systems and structures they need to make it go, to manage infrastructure, to decide where investments happen. And to me, that's the core component of what we're up to here. I don't know, Sasha, do you want me to talk more about what we're doing this year now, or do you want to just talk and
Maybe we should pause for a minute, and if there's some time, we do have some questions people sent in earlier, but if Tammy, if you have any questions, or Alexius, anyone who's on has questions, I'll give it a couple minutes. Otherwise, I do have some that people sent in earlier. So, and then if there's time at the end, absolutely, it'd be good to link that into what we're doing here. Okay. Well, I will start posing some of the questions that were sent to me earlier, and if anyone listening has more, feel free to chime in. So, one of the questions was, given not only Haiti's history, but their current status of gang control and anarchy, do you see their political situation changing in the near future? And if so, how? And I would say, Dale, feel free to interject as well on this question.
Well, right now is a tough time. It's a very, very tough time. As most of you may know, that the president of the country was assassinated just a year ago, and the parliament has really not been in existence even prior to that and functional. And now they're extra constitutional. There's really not provisions in how they would go forward. And the current prime minister, who's now been there for a year, has not called for elections, and to my knowledge, nor has there been a definitive investigation that's disclosed who was responsible for his assassination. And so, as a result, the gangs have taken control. The prime minister is not really stopping them. Other countries like the United States, people say, well, should intervene and whatnot, but people are hesitant to do that. As you know, it's very difficult to occupy another country and try to put order in their system. And there's not a lot of political will here in the United States for that right now, at least. So it's sort of like in a state of limbo. I don't know, Neil, you can add to that.
yeah, I mean, it's a mess, like you said, Dale. It's really a mess. And again, I come back to what I mentioned, which is the lack of systems and structures that allow for the country to govern itself. All the way from the Constitution, the piece of paper that the country uses and decides, here's how we want to function as a country, and here's how we're going to elect a president, here's how we're going to elect senators. It's almost like that document itself presents a set of challenges for governing the country, like it needs to be rethought. And I honestly believe that Haiti has functioned outside of its constitution virtually in perpetuity, right? Not just in the last 2 or 3 years, but throughout its entire history. And again, don't try and make excuses for this, but the lack of funds is a core component of that, right? Their need to pay off France took funds away that would have directly built those systems. How are they managing the gangs? Very poorly right now. Haiti's military that did keep a hold on the country for several decades was disbanded in 1994 as part of the agreement with the United States. That was the only kind of remaining structured system that Haiti had to keep things under wraps. That, by the same token, had a very evil component to it, a very detrimental component towards the management of the systems. But certainly 30 years ago, there was virtually no crime in Haiti. We lost Dale. There was almost no petty crime in Haiti 30 years ago, compared with today, where the gangs really rule the country. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Another question that segues kind of into what you just discussed is, I've heard it said that Haiti would be better off today if it had not become independent from France. What do you think about that?
If it had not become independent from France, I don't know. I would have to disagree with that, I think, because I'm not sure how much France invested in Haiti. They were taking a lot away from the country in the form of natural resources, timber and sugarcane and so on and so forth. It was very much an exploitive relationship. I don't know, Dale, you can chime in on that, but it was, I would argue, I don't know.
I got cut off. I'm not sure what you're addressing.
The question was, would Haiti be better off now if if they hadn't become independent from France?
Well, it would all be probably Dominican Republic, right? Kind of like Cuba is all one country. I would say possibly, at least.
So
It's difficult to
possibly it would be
speculate
better
on
off, you think?
Well, the Dominican's better off now, but here's an interesting story. I met an older gentleman, somebody more or less my age, who remembers that post World War II, he said that Haiti and the Dominican were about the same level of development. That's what he told me. And I said,
so held true all the way to 1990, honestly.
Yeah, well, what happened? I said, and while he said to a certain extent the Duvaliers, because they had such a control over the country that a lot of the middle class and the people who made things work fled the country. And, statistically, at least from what I've read, that as many as 30,000 people were killed by the Duvaliers. So there's brain drain or fear, and, people fled and migrated away that could. So what happens to a country where that happens, which may have happened even regardless of who the dictator was. But today the Dominican is definitely better off. But again, what Neil said about, and I mentioned too, the money that the indemnities that they had to pay back to France, I mean, it's incalculable what the damage was that was that did to the economy.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess if I was going to finish the answer to that question, I would look at other French colonies around the world. France had lots of colonies, not just Haiti.
Yeah.
So,
right.
How are those colonies doing?
Yeah, that would be an interesting research question in general, I think.
Yeah.
Because if you were to compare, Western African countries that were colonized by the French versus those by the British, they're different.
Oh yeah,
very different. So it would be interesting.
Yeah.
And
there's lots of factors going into that, explaining the way that is, including the justice system.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, they inherited the justice in the Napoleonic Code.
It's civil law versus common law. Yeah, that makes a difference. Then there's also just the Caribbean, because there's Martinique, there's Guadeloupe, which were also colonized, and that would be probably more interesting to examine in terms of a more comparable case study between Haiti and say
Oh.
Guadeloupe to see what the
You know,
difference.
one thing people don't realize, United States, and all our claims of liberty and all that stuff, we
Mhm,
didn't recognize Haiti as an independent country until Abraham Lincoln in 1863, in the middle of our own Civil War.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we didn't help.
yeah. So that was a question we can't fully answer, but it was a very interesting question. All right, another one. So this was I have always wondered about how Haiti's terrain impacts finding water. My understanding is that it's very mountainous. Are there actually areas of Haiti that Neil and Dale feel will never have a well because they are so remote and difficult to get to?
Um, yeah, my connection got unstable there, but it sounded like it was a question about whether there's water everywhere in the country.
The question is, does the mountainous terrain impact your ability to essentially help people get water? And because are there some areas that they won't have access because of that?
Sure. Yes, the short answer to that is yes, it's very true. Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the joint island of Hispaniola, is a very, very mountainous country. Uh, Haiti has a peak that's over 8,000 feet. The Dominican has one over 10,000 feet high. It's a very, very mountainous country, and in those situations, those mountains and the geology around that create an environment where you don't have universal aquifers across the entire island. So, yeah, the short answer is not everywhere is going to have access to water. The same way not everywhere has access to water anywhere else in the world, right? There's a reason people don't live in Death Valley, California,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there are those places where you just simply cannot find water within a reasonable distance of the surface. And um, that being said, there are a significant number of areas in Haiti that do have access to water. Haiti receives a lot of rainfall, and that does a great job of recharging the aquifers. I don't think that the aquifers are being overdrawn as they are in many other countries around the world. So, from a purely technical standpoint, I think that there's enough available water in the country to cover, but certainly not everywhere is going to have access to water.
All right. Another question. Let's see. Given what you just said, and this was in relation to a different question, um, how would that impact? So this was related to the gang question that we asked earlier. How would that impact the work that you were doing there? So how does gang activity impact your work?
Well, um, it's highly disruptive, is the short answer to that. Uh, the gangs, the the centralized government that has been created over the last half a century has created the potential for choke points to occur in the conversation in the country. And I say that kind of intentionally by saying that by creating a centralized government in Port-au-Prince, you create an environment where if they control one area of the country, then you control everything in the country. The everything occurs in Port-au-Prince. You need to get a passport, you need to go to Port-au-Prince. You need to get a visa, you need to go to Port-au-Prince. You need to get a driver's license,
Mm,
you need to go to Port-au-Prince. You need a copy of your birth certificate, you need to go to Port-au-Prince. Everything occurs in Port-au-Prince. And the lack of investment in expansive and redundant infrastructure creates an environment where the gangs control one road and they cut off the entire southern part of the country. The gangs control 3 roads and they completely isolate Port-au-Prince from the rest of the country. So it's hugely disruptive to have the gang activity going on. Virtually all cargo goes in and out of Port-au-Prince. All the taxes that are collected across the country go to Port-au-Prince. So if you need to buy anything, Haiti has to import almost all of its foodstuffs, rice, oils, beans, cement. Very, very little of that comes into the country anywhere but through Port-au-Prince. So when the gangs take control of these various areas of the city, it leads to fuel shortages. The only place that fuel can be brought into the country is in Port-au-Prince. So the gangs control those areas. So for the last year and a half, we've suffered from devastating fuel shortages, combined with the regular as a result of the gang activity, but just huge disruptions to the food supply, to the fuel supply, and to schools and to everything else. It's a real downward spiral for the country.
And that being said, however, we occupy, our activities are not in Port-au-Prince. And so in the countryside where we are mostly involved, I don't know, wouldn't you say, Neil, life is kind of normal? I mean, obviously with fuel being one major exception, because we're able to function and we're able to continue the work we're doing to a certain extent.
Well, yeah, I mean, from a peace standpoint, a peace and security standpoint, I would say the country is very calm outside of that. But the choke hold of the gangs on the economic core of the country has led to 100% inflation in the last year. The good has lost in value. Rice, oil, all the imported foodstuffs have doubled in price in the last 3 to 4 months. So while it may be calm out here, it is certainly not a nice situation. Let me say it that way. It's economically crippling to the entire population of the country.
Right. But we are continuing our work, right? I mean,
Well, absolutely. And, one of the testaments in my world is that in the areas where Haiti Outreach has put in a significant number of these community wells in this managed infrastructure, you don't see these breakdowns occurring. We see the communities adapting and finding new ways to manage their water supply and keep things going. So, to me, that's fantastic example of resiliency. When the earthquake occurred down in Cavaillon last fall, the wells that Haiti Outreach had in those areas were back online within 24 hours. They were back online. That's resilient infrastructure managed by the local community that essentially eliminated the need for people to deliver relief into that area for water, in terms of water. Those wells were back online within 24 hours, despite something like 94 or 96% of the houses being destroyed. So they were able to get the well back online and have access to water while they were trying to figure out how to rebuild. So it's that kind of resiliency that we're looking to build, that kind of structure and managed infrastructure that we're working to establish across the country. And quite frankly, the language and tools that we've used to develop those communities over the years, we're now turning towards the central government to find ways in how we can help them develop systems that are more resilient and have more integrity.
Why don't you speak a little more into that, Neil, and then we'll kind of talk about our training program that we have.
Sure. over the years, we've had an opportunity to train quite a few, I would say, lower government officials. And over the years, those officials have risen through the ranks and are now beginning to populate positions of authority within the government. We are maintain relationships with them. They've done a fantastic job of being leaders and utilizing the tools and technologies that we've helped them develop over the years. And as such, we've been asked to help bring some of our leadership training to the National Water Agency. So we're actively working now on a set of training frameworks to bring leadership and integrity to the entire 1,200 person workforce of the National Water Agency across the country. So that is an ongoing thing. That's what we're here for tonight, is to actually present that program, and that's what we're raising money for tonight. We probably foresee that this will cost more than $100,000 over the next year or year and a half. But the first set of trainings are going to be occurring this fall and will be in the $30,000 range. So this is the immediate need and request.
Yeah.
We have a lot of faith in this program and the set of tools that have been created.
And
So-
truly, you know, that is one of the things for a government to, or for a country to be developed, you have to have a government that works, and that, you know, there's certain things that NGOs can do to help, but this is an infrastructure issue, and so the government should be taking ownership for that. And that's, you know, in a way going against the grain, but it's so crucial for Haiti to really thrive and flourish. And so we estimate it's about 30,000 to cover this training, and that's what, you know, that's what we're developing a campaign for. And we also can use support just on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. People can give as little as $30 a month or more, whatever they feel compelled to give. So so that's certainly helpful. It helps us to sustain our work as well. Tammy, you had an interesting question. How do we pray for Haiti as a country, new leadership, gangs to have less control? Is there a solution? I will speak quickly. I'll say, you know, a lot of what we're doing is the solution, which is equipping leaders not only at the government level, but at the community level, and helping people recognize that they have capacity to affect change for the better in their own lives, which is very different from what they've been told for many generations, which is that they are inferior and they have to wait to be rescued or wait for help to come, but to recognize that they don't have to, that they can be change agents in their own lives. And so, you know, continue to pray for leadership, for mentality changes, and for you know, organizations like Haiti Outreach that understand that development is the way forward, that long-term relief efforts are not going to make a difference long-term. They're important during certain situations like a natural disaster or a war, but when we continue to put band-aids on gaping wounds, we're not going to progress long-term. And so, you know, so that's really the issue. And we're up against a mentality as well in the sector where people think, well, I'll just send food, I'll just send water, I'll just send clothes, not recognizing that these good intentions are not helping long term. So I would say pray for that, and also continue to just be an advocate for concepts like this that are working and that are proven effective.
Yeah, one thing I mentioned, our leadership programs are intended to empower people, as Sacha was alluding to, that they see that they themselves have the ability and the skills and the knowledge and can become leaders themselves and can forward things. They don't have to be dependent on, you know, Port-au-Prince or the president or especially other NGOs, which actually can keep them from developing themselves. And so our technology, we call it, which is just the way we interact and the different trainings we have, are intended to empower people so that they will take on a level of responsibility that maybe is unique for them, and they weren't brought up to think that they can or should. But it's the only way the country can become developed, is to have the people themselves take on that level of authority and responsibility. So that's what that's about.
Yeah. It's a great answer. So
Mhm.
Tammy, if you want to pray for something, I would say pray for the Haitian people to realize how powerful they really are.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and they can do it. They can do it themselves. They have to develop the ability and the skills and the willingness and hopefully the cooperation. That's where
Right.
it's also important. Everybody sometimes wants to be a chief, but there has to be cooperation, and people have to honor each other.
Well, thank you,
Okay.
everyone. Those are all the questions that we have submitted. Of course, people are always welcome to write us if they have more questions. Our email is info@haitioutreach.org. And I will be posting this on YouTube tomorrow, and I will email everyone who had requested a recording of this. They'll receive that tomorrow. But thank you so much for your time and your attention, Neil and Dale. Thank you so much for the information. It was really valuable and important to hear just how the past impacts the present. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
You
All
too.
right.
Thank you. Thanks, Tammy.
Yep.